Holland Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello, and welcome to our podcast on health and aged care issues for an international and cross-border perspective. In this series, we'll be chatting with our colleagues from UK law firm Mills and Reeve so that we can bring to you both an Australian and UK perspective on topical issues in this sector. Today, we're focusing on life sciences, which includes health and medical research, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices. My name is Alison Choi Flanagan, and I co-head the Health and Care Group at Holland Wilcox. Today, I'm joined by James Fry, a partner and head of life sciences at Mills Reeve, and we're going to discuss key trends in life sciences in the UK and Europe. James heads Mills and Reeve, fast-growing multidisciplinary life sciences practice and focuses exclusively on the sector. The practice supports clients in the pharma and biotech, medical device, diagnostic, medtech, and digital health subsectors. James' own practice focuses on intellectual property, commercial contracting, and regulatory work. Welcome, James. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here, Alison.
So let's start off with some of the key trends that you're seeing in life sciences in the UK and Europe.
Yeah, there's a number. There's an awful lot going on at the moment. But if I sort of talk about some of those headline trends, I mean, as we know, the life sciences sector is incredibly innovative, and it's just that sheer pace of acceleration around technology development that is fantastic in terms of the end goal. Obviously, is to meet a lot of these unmet patient needs, but from a legal perspective, they throw up a range of issues. I suppose in terms of new tech, we're talking about new modalities of drugs, whether that's in the cell and gene space or ADCs, etc. But also we're talking about advanced technologies and how technologies such as artificial intelligence, potentially in the future quantum computing, are going to make an impact within the sector, and they all raise additional legal issues as we know. I mean, interestingly, what we're seeing in relation to AI is it is being used to speed up clinical trials, speed up the drug discovery process. I think what we're starting to sort of see is in terms of the shift to target identification, target validation as well. And I think that sort of will drive some really interesting themes. I suppose the second theme is around in investment. Obviously, the capital markets have been pretty flat within the UK and Europe, and obviously within the US as well. We're starting to see some green shoots of recovery. VC investment is accelerating, and we're seeing a lot of work in that space. But I suppose the scarcity of available funds will mean that businesses are looking at alternative means to fund their business. So we're seeing a lot of out licensing transactions at the moment within the UK and Europe. Regulatory uncertainty. We have seen for a while quite a bit of divergence between the UK and the European Union. You may ask me a question later on about whether a change of UK government is going to mean that we shift back more to alignment. I think we will, but let's talk about that later on. But that causes challenges for businesses where you're trying to, for example, get your medical device approved both on sort of dual track basis within the UK and the European Union. I suppose in terms of regulation as well, we're starting to see the impacts of some US regulation, particularly on deal making within the UK and in Europe. So examples there are the Inflation Reduction Act, the impact that is having, particularly in terms of out licensing transactions, but also M&A, and also the Biosecure Act, which I think will require businesses to look and carry out regular audits of their supply chains. Supply chain is a recurring theme we are seeing more and more, obviously in terms of some geopolitical issues causing businesses to look at their supply chains. And then the other impact we are seeing more and more, and I'm assuming it's the same in Australia, is in relation to ESG, so environment, sustainability, and governance, a real driver from, say, the NHS in the UK to require businesses to be carbon neutral, and that being part of the process. But that is obviously sort of driving a lot of change within the sector.
We're seeing ESG as a big focus for biotech, pharmaceutical, medical devices in Australia as well. Been to a few forums where they've been talking about some of the processes that they're doing to become more environmentally friendly, for example. So it's interesting that it is I agree, it's becoming quite a big issue for the sector. So you've mentioned AI. Do you want to talk a bit about the European legislation on AI? Everyone's really interested in that.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, it met all the final hurdles for approval within the European Parliament. What the EU AI Act does is to apply a risk-based approach to AI systems. In terms of the definition of what AI is, this legislation looks very much at the OECD, so the standard definitions of what AI is. What the Act does principally, as I mentioned, it's a risk-based approach. It prohibits certain AI systems. And then in terms of everything else, it classifies those between high-risk systems and other AI systems. If a system is regarded as a high-risk system, then there is a requirement on the developer to have quite stringent processes around monitoring, around transparency, around conformity assessments, and to register that and record that with the European regulators as well. We're starting to see some quite useful stuff coming out of the EMA and some of the European regulators within the life sciences space. What they seem to be suggesting, and the line of direction, is there will be a focus in terms of medical devices using AI systems, and a number of those will be classified as high-risk systems. As we know, the classification of medical devices, it is based on third-party conformity assessment, so that I suppose there are no surprises there. I think what developers will need to do at a fairly early stage is to first of all assess whether their product is going to fall within the high risk classification. Some useful feedback has come out of the regulators in terms of things like sort of preclinical activity, use of AI systems in terms of sort of early stage drug discovery, and the general view is actually that those will fall outside of the high risk classification. So real focus really in relation to, as I said, medical devices. So first of all, that early stage classification is going to be key, an assessment in terms of whether it is high risk or falls outside of that classification, and then a real focus around governance. So some of the issues to think about is, first of all, the being able to secure and then validate rights for data used to train models, using diverse and reliable data sets for use within the AI system, and with high risk categories of AI system, there is going to be a requirement to demonstrate that the system is being used to augment human human decision making. So it can be a requirement for that human oversight. The regulators will need to be satisfied in that regard. Helpfully, there are sort of regulatory sandboxes that can be used as well, whereby you would interact with the regulator to assess the impact of the AI system, and we're starting to sort of see that trickle into the UK as well. So our regulator has recently issued missives around establishing its own AI airlock, which will allow innovators again to engage with the MHRA at an early stage, but also with people like the NHS AI lab to really assess the impact of the AI system, and then to define the protective measures that will need to be applied around it.
So are you seeing many of your clients starting to prepare for compliance with that legislation?
Certainly, absolutely. The application of the Act is around 2 years off, but for some innovators, particularly in terms of those who already have developed systems, there's probably quite a bit of work to do to carry out that assessment and then to make any changes that are going to be necessary to assess compliance. The other thing to note is that the Act has extraterritorial application, so it will apply to systems developed outside of the EU. If they impact EU citizens, or they are to be used in any way within the EU, then the Act will apply. So there is a real focus, Alison. I suppose one of the key issues, though, is that we don't have AI legislation at the moment within the UK. There is no federal law within the US around AI as well. So there is also a need to watch this space in terms of other jurisdictions when they seek to regulate, and they're all planning to do that. You would tend to, I think, sort of take the view that the EU will be higher bar, and possibly more restrictive. So if you comply with the EU, can you then use as a benchmark in terms of use of that product elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So, for example, in Australia, we don't have specific AI legislation, but the Australian government has announced that it will be implementing legislation, and the Australian government has published an interim response to safe and responsible AI in Australia. And they're identifying that, there's a number of existing laws that they're looking to amend, for example, privacy legislation. And quite often, Australia does look to the UK and EU about therapeutic goods regulation. So, for example, CE certification in Europe is acceptable in Australia. So that's why I'm really interested, and a lot of people in Australia are really interested to see what's happening in the UK and EU, because, likely a lot of those trends will come to Australia. We currently have, for example, medical devices, certain medical devices, software is a medical device. So, and we have regulations similar to what you just described as a risk-based approach. So, for example, software that actually diagnoses patients could be a medical device as compared to simple patient information is not necessarily a medical device. So, again, the Australian legislation currently has that risk-based approach. So it's really interesting to see what's happening in the EU. In relation to the other trends that you're seeing in life sciences, you mentioned some other things, for example, ESG. Seeing anything in relation to that in any regulatory or legislative areas?
You are. I mean, it is being driven, I think, also by the within the UK by the ultimate payers. So the NHS, in terms of its own procurement strategies, will require developers of products to be able to sort of demonstrate their their net zero plans, their carbon reduction plans, which they're required to submit as part of the process for entering into those procurement contracts. We are seeing it in the context of contracts as well. So I think there is a lot of sort of innovation within the supply chain. So you're seeing quite sort of innovative contracting structures, more principle-based contracting structures between constituent parts of the supply chain, which are all driven to driving carbon reductions across the supply chain. We've seen the regulators very much take a more rigorous approach in terms of particularly around environment and sustainability, and we are seeing it crop up in some of the legislation. I mean, you may, Alison, have seen the European Union Pharma reforms. So that is a plan by the European Commission to reset all of the European Union pharmaceutical legislation. Part and parcel of that is a focus on ESG as well.
What we're seeing is in the procurement, a lot of government departments are requiring ESG sort of initiatives as part of the procurement process. And some of the issues that our ESG group are advising clients on are issues with greenwashing. So, because obviously if you make statements about being environmentally friendly and if they're not true, then that's in breach of the Australian consumer law as misleading or deceptive conduct. And also what we call black cladding, which is some of our government agencies like to see Aboriginal and Indigenous input into this procurement supply. And what some organisations are doing is, setting up companies with token Aboriginal directors and not necessarily complying with the intent and the spirit. Are you seeing that as well in the UK?
Certainly in relation to greenwashing, absolutely, and a focus on the relevant regulatory bodies around that, absolutely.
So you mentioned that you've got a new government in the UK. What are its priorities with regard to life sciences, and what do you think the trend will be in relation to UK and EU? And we, won't necessarily mention Brexit, but as a result of Brexit.
I don't think there's any plans to become to rejoin the European Union. The new Labour government has only been in for a matter of weeks. However, it did issue its life sciences manifesto before the general election. In terms of their key focus, there will be a focus on ESG and net zero intentions. I suspect, if anything, it will require an acceleration of companies' plans to demonstrate that they are carbon neutral. The new Labour government has put life sciences very much as a priority sector. It will, I suppose, develop the powers of the Office of the Life Sciences, and the remit of the OLS will principally now sit under the health secretary. So there is that real alignment. We've had an issue for some time, Alison, in terms of the connection between the life sciences industry and the NHS, and I think what we can see going forward is more alignment, more collaboration envisaged and encouraged between the private sector and the public sector. So some of the things they are looking at will be around cutting red tape, and we've seen that in terms of some of the early plans around approvals process as well, so speeding that up, but also around data data access, a focus on federated data systems within the NHS. So giving industry the ability to be able to tap into some of this this data, really aimed at speeding up approval processes and getting medicines and devices to market. A renewed focus on funding. So under the Conservative government, there was a commitment to apply more patient capital, so capital sitting within the pensions funds, to some of our fast-growing sectors, which included life sciences. There's a recommitment to that by the Labour government. I suspect there will be a greater diversity of funds available. So with the Labour government, traditionally focus on grant funding, but also different levels of investment, and giving British Business Bank, which is owned by the government, greater remit, greater funds to be able to invest in some of these fast-growing disruptive technologies. There will be a lot of regulatory reform, I suspect, under the Labour government, and really an acknowledgement by the government as to some of the issues in terms of the friction between trade between the UK and the European Union, and the sort of the semblances of some statements around the possibility to move closer to the EU in terms of regulatory alignment as well. And I suspect that we will see that. I think some of the challenges that businesses have had, particularly within the medical devices space, is effectively the requirement to follow that dual process around registration of your device within the UK and then the EU. So I think anything around driving more regulatory alignment is going to be welcomed by industry.
Absolutely. And we act for a number of Australian biotech companies, health and medical research universities, and some startups, and they might be looking overseas whether to attract capital investment or whether they want to enter into any licensing arrangements. Do you have some tips for them if they want to enter into the UK market?
So I think what any Australian company will need to be cognizant of really is having a clear understanding of the regulatory pathway within the UK in terms of getting their product first of all registered, but then into UK healthcare systems. So really it's a sort of dual stage process, getting your product approved and then dealing with pricing, reimbursement, getting your product into the NHS. There's always been that close alignment between the UK and Australia. We now have our international recognition procedure that's mainly been around medicines, but if a product has already been approved in Australia, then there is the potential for it then to be mutually recognised within the UK system, and a fast track process for getting that product approved. There will be a number of incentives available to an Australian business. It will need to think around its structures. So, for example, should it be establishing a UK entity, a UK subsidiary, in order to get the benefit of UK funding through grant funding, etc. I think the licensing is always going to be relatively straightforward. Our legal systems are quite similar when it comes to contracting, etc. We have that similarity, that commonality. A licensing deal, as we all know, is a contract. So it's based on similar principles, similar commonalities. I suppose one of the key thing will be to understand who those potential license partners, distribution partners are. the various sort of networks, I think, probably can help with that in terms of sort of matching up like-minded organisations. We do commonly see collaborations between UK industry and Australian institutions, research institutions as well. So again, there is that existing relationship that should drive, I think, some interesting collaborations.
It's interesting. So for example, European and UK companies coming to Australia, very similar to you, they need to understand the regulatory requirements for registration of the medical device or pharmaceutical product in Australia with what we call the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is the FDA equivalent, but also the reimbursement. So Australia has both a public and private healthcare system. So understanding the reimbursement in relation to that system. Australia is a little bit different in that we need to have an Australian resident sponsor for the TGA, whereas that's not a requirement in some other jurisdictions. Is that a requirement in the UK or not?
It is. So in terms of any UK registration, it will need to be obtained either by the manufacturer or a licensee of the manufacturer, who could be a distributor.
And that has to be a UK company?
Yes, it has to be UK entity.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's similar to us. So it's really interesting to see what the similarities and what the differences are. We recognise EU CE certification, so that helps in terms of the manufacturing requirements for good manufacturing processes. So that's aligned between the EU and Australia, and I assume that's the same with the UK.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. And what sort of trends are you seeing in the UK and Europe in relation to deal making for life sciences, M&A deals or licensing deals?
So as I said earlier, we have seen a switch because the investment markets have been relatively flat within the UK and Europe. We have seen businesses looking at non-dilutive funding through licensing deals. So clearly that works quite nicely for say a biotech business with a platform. They could look to do a number of out licensing deals with, say, pharmaceutical licensees or other biotech businesses. So we have seen a lot of licensing. Those kinds of deals come in all different shapes and forms. I suspect it's similar in Australia. So interestingly, we're seeing a lot of co-development deals at the moment, and those may be part and parcel of a licensing or partnering deal, or entirely separate, some kind of sort of evaluation deal. But a lot of activity in that kind of space. Investment is still, I suppose, sort of chugging along. It does just take businesses that much longer to secure investment. So we're still a lot of sort of internal rounds. So until the markets really pick up, businesses looking at doing further raises through current investor base. So it can be a bit of an issue in terms of, for example, getting a new lead investor on a new round. But having spoken to my VC team this morning, I mean, their view is actually there is quite a bit of buoyancy in the marketplace, certainly up to Series A. We're starting to see some M&A. So quite a bit of M&A activity between pharmaceutical companies. So acquisitions of, I suppose what we say is actually sort of drug asset acquisitions seem to be back at the moment, and there's quite a bit of activity in that space. At the beginning of the year, we did see a lot of acquisitions of biotechs by large pharma as well. That activity, I think, has tailed off slightly. However, I think our predictions are that the market is going to pick up towards the end of this year, and I think that's driven by a large pharma sitting on quite a bit of cash. also a real need for large pharma to build their pipeline, to replenish their pipelines, particularly as drug assets get close to the patent cliff. The Inflation Reduction Act, which I mentioned earlier, I think is starting to have some impact in terms of UK and European deals. So possibly a switch away from small molecules to biologics. And I think that will drive some M&A as well, with large pharma maybe refocusing to be more, I suppose, aligned to biologics going forward. We're certainly also seeing that in deal terms as well. So royalty reductions applying to compounds that are subject to the IRA at a future date as well. So quite a bit of I suppose change within the deal market space as well.
We're finding that, like historically, large pharmaceutical companies used to do a lot of their R&D in-house, and now what they do is less in-house, and that they buy R&D from other organisations once they're more proven. We've got a client at the moment. We're doing a capital raise for them, so there's definitely activity, but I think the investors are being more fussy. They're being more selective in their investments. That's what we're finding. Well, are there any other final comments you want to make, James?
I don't think so. I think a lot of it is watch this space, Alison. We talked about the EU AI Act. We've mentioned the EU pharma reforms as well. That will definitely have some impact within the pharma space. It really is sort of understanding, what is going on within the UK and Europe, particularly in terms of understanding some of those regulatory changes, which I think will continue at a pace within the region.
Thank you. So thanks everyone for listening today. As always, please get in touch with us. If you have any questions, you can find our details on the Hullamore Cox or Mills and Reeve websites, or contact us on LinkedIn. If you've enjoyed today's episode, then rate, review, or follow our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We've got another podcast coming up in relation to healthcare. Please join us. Thank you.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.